right, it is 7:17. We're still here on April 25th. There were a few more people I think that signed up. If we're here, I'm going to give them a chance to speak. Roy Whaley, no. Craig Nazer, Patricia Schaub. Go on down, Craig. Is Cesar Acosta here? Okay. Mr. Nazer.
Okay. Hello, my name is Craig Nazer, and I lived in District 7. Here are some things I believe are important to keep in mind about a new code. In most capitalist societies, density does not equal affordability. If it did, Manhattan Island would certainly be the most affordable place in America. It's not. Even so, what is meant by affordable? If you cannot be exact about that, then you risk deeply offending the very people you're trying to help. It would make far more sense to increase the minimum wage to a living wage, make a good education more affordable, make health care more affordable, and guarantee a reasonable retirement. Unfortunately, these are all very hard things for the city of Austin to do. I also want to mention impervious cover. Climate change is upon us and is likely to be worse than our politically impaired scientific reports are able to convey. Trading the more restrictive impervious cover limits demanded by climate change for more density will kill people, destroy property, and eventually cost the taxpayer millions. Please don't do it. Now, a couple weeks ago, in my neighborhood, we had a rain event that was 3 inches of rain per hour for 2 hours. It happened to be an unfortunate position where I had to walk down Breaker Lane to I-35 to rent a car because my car wouldn't work. And it was just astonishing the amount of water that was on the street. There are areas of Breaker Lane that had 4 inches or more of water on them. Water was running down these little creeks and streams, and the older developed part between North Lamar and I-35, the distinct smell of sewage was coming up as old sewage systems were overflowing. And as you all probably know, Walnut Creek, where all this place runs, is still out of compliance with the Clean Water Act. I think after seeing that, I was really, really shocked by that event. And that was just 3 inches of rain per hour for 2 hours. That was 6 inches of rain. Rain bombs like that are going to become more common. And we just need to be ready for it. We cannot let the demands of the developer community mean that the rest of us have to pay in the end for the damage that climate change is going to do. And I don't see us really moving ahead to really address that, and I don't think the City Council can either. You've done a good job already as far as you can. So I think now we have to prepare for what's coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, those were the people we called who had signed up. All right, colleagues, did you sign up too? Yes. I don't see your name. Come on up, tell me your name.
Hi there, my name is Cesar Acosta. I live in District 4.
Go ahead. You have a minute.
Thank you.
I'm sorry? It was 3 minutes for the first 20 speakers that spoke? No, we donated time. Oh, donated time. Ah, I now see. Okay, you popped up on my calendar, my schedule. Tyler Markham and Josiah Stevenson. And you get a total of 2 people to donate time, so you have 3 minutes.
Thank you.
There's a third that signed up, but there's a limit of 2. Go ahead.
I appreciate your time. The thing I want to stress most is just that land development code should be viewed in the sense of decades. The increases in cost of living, the displacement as a result of which are not the result of sudden changes, but rooted in developments that have been going on for tens of years that are rooted in a code that's been in existence for 30. So we need to make sure to look at land development code in the sense of those timescales. And if we want to make sure that we're planning for a community in Austin 30 years from now that is diverse and integrated, then we need to plan housing that is also diverse and integrated. It is important that we have missing middle housing, duplexes, three or fourplexes across the city, and by right, in as many places as we can afford to. If for nothing else, then we can make sure that in the time between now and then, there's the opportunity for those places to exist for families to move into them. If you allow for only one type of home to exist in an area, that means that only one type of income can live in that area, only one station of life that can be in those areas. I strongly encourage you to consider that in the terms that you're now. It's not something I envy of you that you have to make a decision that really is going to benefit people that are going to be voting 20, 30 years from now, not the people of today. The things that are going to benefit the people who are most vulnerable now are going to be high investments in public infrastructure like the affordable housing bond that just passed. But for land development code, you should really be thinking of the folks who will be here in a while from now. So we need to make sure that we're investing time and resources into the kinds of housing and mixing of incomes across the board. So those are really just the things I want to make sure to consider. I've been privileged enough to live in Austin for 4 years, and in that time I've lived in St. John's that entire time. I've seen the changes in my community as they've happened. And again, these are not things that have happened suddenly. They've been in the works for a while. And because of the restraints of housing that exist in other neighborhoods that have been more privileged economically and politically to organize, they are now the ones who are pressured to get the increases in density. But you have the opportunity now to put a more fair playing field for the next round of development that occurs. So I strongly encourage you to consider that today and make that part of your process. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And then I think there may be another person who has signed up. Mary Budachowski.
Never got it right.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Mary Pistievsky, and I'm going to keep it short because I only have a minute. I'm really concerned about climate change. As I'm sure you know, we have 11 years to stave off the most extreme impacts of climate change, and the best way that we can do that is by not mandating parking. Parking causes impervious cover, it causes additional flooding, it causes heat island effects, and it encourages people to drive. So we need to completely eliminate parking minimums citywide. We already have it in downtown, and magically Google is suddenly going to build a 16-story building, or a 33-story building with 16 floors of parking. So I don't think the parking minimums and removing them is necessarily going to solve all the problems, but it can do a lot. And then in addition, if you think about all this impervious cover, if we can have 3 houses on top of each other instead of 3 houses spread out, that's less impervious cover. So I think about that a lot, and I really hope that you consider less parking and less impervious cover. Thank you.
Thank you. Our colleagues, that gets us back. What we have on the floor is the main motion, and then we have a series of amendments to the main motion, and we can consider those and amendments to those amendments. And then we can consider other amendments as we go through. Just by looking at what's left on the amendments on this section, in terms of just timing and speed and issues that are coming, we've hit 2 of the really hard issues. As I look at the Amendment A document, we were on page 3, halfway through. We had hit all of the amendments in that section above that were part of the amendments on Amendment A. So there's nothing left in that section to amending the amendment, because we're now amending the amendments. We're not amending the base motion. In section 2, which is on the second half of that page, it looks like the chief issue in front of us that is covered by an amendment that we'll discuss is the issue of prioritization. The second big issue that looks like it's coming up is at the bottom of the page, the preservation incentives. There's an amendment on that. And on the next page, there's an amendment that went to the kind of the geographic percentages. You know, do we want to have a percentage in a certain part of town or not? The next amendment that Councilmember Ellis brings to us at the top of page 5 is the one that talks about the transition area and describes that. So that would be the topic then addressed there. And then down below that, We talk about, I'm not sure those are, then I think the real big thing that's after that is the criteria to take into account in transition areas if we have one, which is on page 6. When we consider these amendments that are coming up, with respect to the preservation, the residential uses being allowed in commercial zoning categories, we're probably going to recommend that alter number 2 amendment be incorporated into that language. We think that's a good thing to happen. Natasha had language with respect to kind of the percentage in the geographic area, which is on the top of page 4, that we'll recommend that we take a look at. And then Councilmember Kitchen had some criteria on the transition area that we'll recommend that we take a look at. That would get us through the amendments that have been offered by Ellis, and that would put us in a position then to go through the other amendments and see what's still relevant, what can we just immediately accept, and what do we need to discuss.
There's one more.
Yes?
In the parking, I had one in the
Oh,
parking.
and the parking. I missed. I dropped that one out.
Okay.
Yes. Because it takes it away from
It changes,
no parking.
It changes what's in there.
It's
so.
the elimination issue.
Yeah.
Yes, more globally set.
Yeah.
Okay? Yes, Councilmember Poole.
I think we agreed at the end when we were taking our dinner break that we would start with the question that I had on code text A. Code text on question 2A.
Yeah, we still have to go through all the other
Right.
after that.
Right, the problem is that she didn't make any amendments in code text.
I had a question.
Oh, you can certainly ask the question.
What? He's talking about.
Councilmember Ellis, we're considering her amendments now. We have a base motion, which was the thing that was filed back in April. And then we have some amendments that were offered by Councilmember Ellis and me, yes, the two of us. And those amendments are in front of us, and we can certainly amend those amendments. But she doesn't have any amendments in code text section. So you can't amend her amendment in code text section because she doesn't have an amendment in code text section.
I'm looking at,
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mayor, but I'm looking at code text, code revisions to provide additional housing capacity should include, and then A is in red and it's underlined. It looks like it's an insertion.
All that is they went from a lowercase a to a higher case a.
It looks
and
like the
those-
entire thing is underlined and then the other A has been deleted.
And I have an amendment
What?
to that one.
So I wanted to start with a question about intent, because I think we may be on the same page, but I don't yet know, and no pun intended.
And
Councilmember
Mayor, I
Ellis?
have an amendment to that one, so.
Well, wait a second. I'm trying to look. My copy apparently
So
is different.
I'm looking
than-
at the yellow document, LDC revision policy document, page
Yes.
3, that's the Adler-Ellis.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong code text section. Yes, that section is certainly
Okay.
in play. One with the prioritization.
Great.
Okay,
All
yes.
right. So my question on A, where it talks about parcels within activity centers for additional housing capacity, is this intended to modify non-zoning regulations to allow for higher unit yields on parcels within activity centers and fronting activity corridors, not corners, corridors? Because that's a shorter way, I think, of saying this, but I want to kind of get a sense if that is the intent.
I'm not sure what the question is. So we're looking on page 3, code text 2.
And it's A,
Okay.
and it's the new language underlined, and it says for parcels within activity
Yes.
centers?
And on activity corridors.
Right.
And what's your question? I'm
So
sorry.
my question was, does this intend to modify non-zoning regulations to allow for higher unit yields on parcels within activity centers and fronting activity corridors?
Yes.
Okay. Is that, Councilmember Ellis, is that your intent too? Okay.
Yes.
Do you think, well, two questions. Would that be simpler to say it that way?
I have no problem with adding and fronting on. Adding the word fronting.
I have an amendment to this
And,
section.
and
We'll
I'm
get there.
not quite
We'll get
done
there in a
yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
We'll get
I thought
there.
you were done.
And
Sorry.
then my second question, does that include utilities? The modification of non-zoning regulations, would that include utilities to be considered in the calculation that would allow for higher unit yields? Because I
Yes,
think the answer would
I
be
think
yes, but I would like to make that clarification.
In the earlier version of this, it listed specific things that would be taken into account.
Okay.
And this amendment takes those things out and basically punts that back to staff
Okay.
and says that prioritize these things, but we're trying to get greater potential housing unit yields.
Okay.
So it leaves that ability for staff to take a look at.
That's really good to hear, and I would like to make sure that it's memorialized for staff that we're interested in including utilities. And my concern is that in this case, for example, we are removing some of the more descriptive, some might say prescriptive language and leaving it open, but in some other areas we are being more descriptive, prescriptive. So I'm trying to find a balance between those two, and in this case I would like to specify that does include utilities.
I would say it includes everything. If we start calling out,
Well, all non-zoning regulations, which would include utilities, is what
Right.
I'm specifically homing in on. And
okay,
if
I don't have any problem saying including utilities.
Thank you.
Because it includes everything. Councilmember Kitchen.
The way I have an amendment for this one,
Okay.
and so it's on page 4 of my document, number 2.
Okay.
I may have been reading this a little differently, but I was reading your language to say that it does establish a priority. It does establish the top priority being the greater housing unit yields. So to my mind, that was giving direction that in all cases you were going to, that in all cases the direction would be to give greater priority to the potential housing unit yields over protecting the environment, over sustainability, over public safety, over transportation, over all of that. So maybe that's not the intent, but I was reading it that way because it says, here's how I was reading it. You can tell me if I misread it, but it says, for these parcels, application of non-zoning regulations should be prioritized in a manner that allows for greater potential housing units. So what I had suggested instead was something that said, non-zoning regulations. Code revisions to provide additional housing capacity should include non-zoning regulations that provide flexibility to allow for higher unit yields for parcels, et cetera, when alternative equivalent means can be determined to ensure the balance of needs while protecting environment and sustainability, landscaping, parkland, and tree preservation, public safety, transportation, utility, and right-of-way. So, to my mind, what I was thinking that the difference was is that the language that's in that you guys have is saying that you will always prioritize getting more units over anything else, any other non-zoning regulations. Where I was trying to say that you would want to be able to prioritize over non-zoning regulations, but you would be looking for alternative equivalent means so you ensured the balance of needs. In other words, I'm not prepared at this point in time to say that in every case that the balance between additional unit and environment and sustainability, for example, is always going to be the additional higher unit. And so I was concerned about that because I felt like we needed, I wasn't prepared to say that in every single case. I wanted to allow us to look at those circumstances.
Correct.
I don't read it that way, the way
Okay.
you just described. So let me see if I can, not having written this thing,
Okay.
give you a sense of what I read when I get this and
Okay.
see if it helps. For me, it does not say prioritize housing unit yield over public safety. It doesn't say prioritize housing unit yield over flooding when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
It says because of course we have to make sure the housing is safe. Of course we have to make sure the housing doesn't flood.
Right.
So it says when looking at that broad breadth of things, make sure there's some prioritization so that we wind up with greater housing unit yields. So that means when you look at all the different stuff, make sure that all of those things don't all get prioritized so much that you wind up with lower housing unit yields. Because we're always striking a balance. Of course, we're never going to say we don't mind if it doesn't catch on fire or you don't mind whether it doesn't flood. So this isn't saying prioritize housing above all else. It says make sure that the non-zoning stuff is balanced in such a way that you will get higher housing unit yields.
Okay, well then I'd like the language to be a little clearer, because it doesn't read that way to me. It reads to me as, because it says, non-zoning regulations should be prioritized in a way that allows for more units. So,
So if what you're saying is that there's some situations, because as a general rule, I think that's where we were coming from.
Right.
As a general rule. But your point is probably a good one, that there may be situations where that's not appropriate.
right,
So what I would be comfortable with would be taking the language that's existing there and just say, should be prioritized in a manner that, and then I would add the word generally, that generally allows for
What
greater
about-
housing potential unit yields, so
Okay.
as to allow for situations where that's not appropriate, or but to say generally, that's the goal we're trying to really hit here, is that focus.
I'd like to suggest the language that I have.
Okay, you certainly
So
can.
if we could look at the language that I have, that is on page 4.
Okay.
I'd like to work off of that language if it's okay for folks.
Councilmember Flanagan.
I don't think we're really that far away, and I think Councilmember Kitchen's language is pretty good, and it satisfies my issues on this. I have separate amendments that will address administrative variances on setbacks to do better tree preservation but not lose a unit, and then the ability to do overlapping regulations like drainage fields and open space where it's safe. So we'll get to those when we get to the addition portion of this process, but I'm satisfied with Councilmember Kitchen's language because I know I got these other amendments coming.
Mayor?
Yes, Councilmember Song.
My only concern, and again, this might be just like you raised, maybe it's because I'm reading it wrong,
Okay.
but it has to do with the word when. So
Which word? When?
The word
Okay.
when, because you say non-zoning regulations that allow higher unit yields when, and when I read when, it means only when there are alternative equivalent means to get everything else.
Okay, is there a better word that would make more sense to you?
I want to raise that. I'm fine with adding the word generally into the mayor's. Let me see if there's a way. I know. So let me see if there's a way that I can get this to mean something similar to that. Just give me a moment to look at it.
You're not trying to change the higher priority for higher unit yields. I mean, that's the focus.
No,
looking
I'm trying to say that we want our non-zoning regulations to be flexible.
Yeah. So.
And-
Yeah, sorry.
And we want to look for alternative equivalent means to ensure that balance. So,
So would it be okay if we ended the sentence where the word when is and created a break there? Non-zoning regulations that provide flexibility to allow higher unit yields for parcels within activity centers and fronting activity corridors, period. The staff should create a code that allows for alternative equivalent means to ensure.
that sounds okay. Can you say that again?
So replace the word when with a period, and then say, the code should create alternative equivalent means, and then cut the words can be determined
To ensure.
to
okay.
ensure.
That works for me.
That works for
Does
me.
that work for-
That's
Mayor.
fine.
Works for me.
Councilmember Flanagan.
Except for the word fronting, which was not in your language, which Councilmember Cassar added. So I would like to not include the word fronting.
Yeah, I have fronting out. I took
Yeah,
fronting out.
but when Greg just reread it, he included the word fronting, and so I just want to make sure that
I need
Okay, so
caffeine
this was
already.
the question that Leslie asked just a second ago. So we're going to need to take a vote on the fronting
Okay.
question. And the issue, what's the issue with respect to fronting or not fronting?
because I may have corridors where I also want higher unit yields in the property that is behind it, that in some corridors is also commercial. So I don't want to preclude this just on the fronting parcel.
Mayor, I'm okay with moving forward without the word fronting at this
Okay.
juncture.
Thank you. All right, so there'd be a period after corridors, and then it would say the code should create alternative equivalent means to ensure the balance of needs.
Right, and then the rest of the sentence.
Okay? People okay with that? Okay?
Mayor,
Yes.
I'm going to need to, we can move on. I'm going to need to think through that a little bit.
Okay.
I think it's definitely better than where we started, but
Okay.
Let's do that. There's nothing here we're doing we can't come back to.
yeah, I just,
Okay? All right. So, yes, Councilmember Tola.
Yeah, I need to ask a clarifying question. So we're taking up some amendments and not others. And as I understand the distinction, we are not taking up the amendments that are amending the base. We're only addressing right now amendments to the amendments on this
Correct.
page,
We're
not
taking-
amendments to the base document.
Not amendments to the base document, but
Okay.
amendments to the amendments in front of us. The
Got it,
amendments in
okay.
front of us are Ellis's amendments.
And yours, yeah.
Is that the same as saying the ones that are additive as opposed to changing language?
I would say that if she took something out, that's also an amendment. Someone could amend something that she took out
Okay.
to put it back in, or we can handle that when we get
Okay.
to the language that people are putting back in. I think that might be an easier thing to do.
Okay.
But we certainly won't miss anything, and people can double back if something got lost in that push.
Okay.
Okay, so that's then the change to 2A. Okay. That gets us then to I see that on D, residential uses should be allowed in commercial zoning categories. We were looking at Councilmember Alter's Amendment 2. She had added language that said draft 3 mapping including affordability requirements for commercial properties where residential uses are not permitted, and these requirements should be maintained in the new draft.
Which one, I'm sorry?
So this is Councilmember Alter, motion sheet 2.
Okay. Question 2. Okay.
Motion sheet 2, question 2. So in lieu of D, we would be comfortable in substituting Councilmember Alter's Amendment 2 on her
Okay, I
page.
see it now. I got it.
So
Sorry, I think some of us don't have our materials organized in the same way you now do. Would you mind telling me again? It's motion sheet 2, and it's residential uses should be allowed in commercial categories,
Yeah.
existing language.
right, if
Draft
you notice,
3 mapping.
yes, those first 6 words that she has there are the 6 words in D on code text.
The whole of, we're considering putting in all of Amendment 2.
In place of what's
Okay.
in D. Because what Councilmember Alter did was to add a sentence to D. Okay? Any objection to that?
I just have a clarifying question. Could you go into just a little more detail about exactly what this is? I know that being newer to this process and digesting it all, I think I'm on board. I just wanted to kind of see your thoughts.
so there were underlying, I'm having trouble finding my own amendment now. In this mess here. Thank you. So draft 3 included that if you were zoned commercial and you were given residential rights, as happens, I think, with VMU, that you would be needing to do affordability in order to be able to do the residential when they thought that was appropriate.
Okay.
And it was mapped in draft 3, and there were some suggestions of changes that they were in the process of when we cut off that where they missed it, that would be assumed to move forward by this.
I appreciate that. I'm supportive of that.
Okay.
Okay? So that change will be made. Councilmember Alter substituted for D. That
Mr.
gets
Mayor,
us,
I
yes?
had something for C.
Okay.
Okay, so on my document, it is on page, let's see, okay, it's on page 4, under code text, it's C. Is everybody there, or? Well, that's what she did.
This is really
That's what Allison did.
easy to do.
No, there is no amendment to C.
Yes, there is. I've got an amendment to C.
No, but there's no Ellis amendment to C that you're amending. There is a preservation incentive in E. Maybe
Wait,
your
I'm not
amendment can go to
understanding,
E.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the distinction.
We are amending Councilmember Ellis's amendments. If she didn't, and mine, I'm going to call it Amendment A, because it's also titled Amendment A. There is, well, it's not the base motion, it's the Amendment A to the base motion. So we are now amending Amendment A to the base motion, and Amendment A doesn't make any changes in C.
Okay, so it has to be redlined on this in order for us to.
Correct.
Okay, sorry.
Correct. Red line.
Okay, I got it now.
Okay. So we changed out D. That gets us to E. E provides an additional preservation incentive that says when you expand, should be expanded. Right now, there's a preservation provision that would be in draft 3. The existing preservation in draft 3 really only applies where there's ADUs, and not every place there's ADUs. And it says the ADU doesn't count toward FAR, and it limits it for houses that are 10 years old. So paragraph E was an attempt to expand the incentives for preservation of existing homes.
Could I ask a question about
Uh-huh.
that? So does that mean preservation incentives? What does that mean? I mean, you're not talking about the historic preservation, are you? Or is that what this is?
No, there's preservation of the existing house with the preservation of an existing structure. The last line it's actually on the next page as it carries over. So there's an incentive that is allowed with the preservation of an existing structure. So if you don't preserve the existing structure, you're not entitled to the additional unit. This provides an additional unit.
So preservation incentives, do those exist right now? Is that what we're saying?
There are some preservation incentives that exist now in draft 3
Okay.
that allow for an ADU not to count toward an FAR limit when an existing house is at least 10 years old is preserved, and that's in some zoning districts, not in every zoning district.
Okay, well then, the language that I had in C could go here.
Okay.
In some ways, they work. I mean, they work together. So, I think it would be appropriate to look at that language right now.
Okay.
C or E? C. The C that I have in
Yes, on page 4 of 8.
Yeah, the C that I have in my document looks like the E that we're talking about right now, I guess is what I'm saying.
And that's what I said. It's like the appropriate place for that was in E, not C.
Okay, well then, can I talk about it now, or? Okay, so what I've got is remodeling should be very simple, so it is much easier to preserve an existing home than tear down and replace it with another larger structure. Provide options to revise the McMansion ordinance that provide for the ability to add a room or limited remodel, but constrain ability to demolish existing home and replace it with another larger single-family home. If an existing affordable home is preserved, the balance of the lot's entitlements can be used to add more dwelling units.
Okay.
So I think that could go.
Well, to me, could that? Let me look at that here just one
They may
second.
go together.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure that they're mutually exclusive.
Right? Yeah, I don't think they are.
Mayor,
Yes.
I'm supportive of this language. I would suggest, so that it best fits in with the preservation bonus of a unit, that we add remodeling or adding units should be very simple.
Okay.
So it is easier to preserve rather than tear down to replace with one big one. The idea being we don't want to make it so complicated to add the unit in the back that people just prefer to tear it down.
Yeah, I'm fine.
So what are you saying?
So I'm very supportive of adding the kitchen language, but I think for it to fit into this section, we should say remodeling or adding units should be very simple.
Okay. And I don't see this as being contradictory, so I would support adding this to that section.
That's fine.
Any objection to that, Mr. Flanagan?
No objection. Separate.
So that one will be added as well. Mr. Flanagan?
So one change I would like to make is remove the word walk shed and have it be a half mile. Since the preservation tools, I think, should be a lot more expansive than just the quarter mile and being so narrowly defined on the walk shed.
Okay. Anybody have an objection to that? Okay, no objection, then that one's added. So we're deleting the word walk shed and we're making it a half a mile. Okay. Any other changes to this E? Yes, Councilmember Harper Madison.
I actually am going back to D, and I think it's going to be pretty simple. I just need a little bit of clarification. That birthday cake got me a little sluggish. Sorry. It said residential uses should be allowed in commercial zoning categories. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what dictates the commercial zoning categories. Where is that? Is that corridors exclusively, or like is there some way to quantify what we mean by commercial zoning categories?
I think that the intent was to say that anywhere where we allow commercial, it used to be that you couldn't put residential there too. You couldn't put an apartment above it, a ground floor commercial use, because it was determined to be inconsistent with a commercial area.
Okay.
But the trends now are to let people live in commercial areas, to live above stores, to be in and among them. It's a more compact and connected way for people to be able to live amongst that kind of activity.
So this doesn't have any clearly defined boundaries or specific, okay.
It just says if you have commercial zoning, let's let people live there too. Okay? So that's D and E.
No, sorry. I
Yes.
have my hand up as well.
That's okay.
Okay, so I am absolutely on board with a preservation requirement, but that's not the only thing that this provision is doing. It's actually, as I understand it, allowing an additional unit to the base zoning in any category, but it is differently applied within the urban core to outside. And I need to understand, especially in light of Imagine Austin and our high opportunity areas, why that distinction is being drawn. And actually, I would like to bring up first the growth concept map for Imagine Austin. And I've, again, misplaced my boundaries for the McMansion area, which is basically the urban core plus, I think, some areas in, if I'm correct, District 2. But as I see the growth concept map, we would be missing the regional center north of 183. We would also be missing those two regional centers that are up closer to 45 and then over in that other area. And then in the south, we'd be missing activity centers for redevelopment in environmentally sensitive areas in the green. South of 71, we'd be missing the neighborhood center,
Why
the
would
other
we be
neighborhood
missing those?
center, the regional center,
Yeah.
because the urban.
Why would we be missing those?
It says inside of those centers and corridors you just listed as well, and within a half mile of them.
Yeah.
It's everywhere in
said-
the urban core.
And it says outside, I thought from our conversation earlier, it was outside the urban core within a half mile of those.
Yes.
Okay, so it would be
So
be
it would
within
cover all those
those. It seems to me, and again, we're doing this kind of without mapping, so it's hard for me to tell how much of that is going to be.
Oh, the corridor itself.
Yeah, I get that. But if we could see the next map, please, the high opportunity areas. We don't have a layer mapping, as I understand, we don't have a layer mapping the high opportunity areas with the half mile we just described from activity centers. But I guess the fundamental question remains, why are we handling within the urban center differently from outside of the urban center?
Mayor?
Yes.
Because it's a reflection of some of what we did in the ASNP about access to transit.
I thought the point of having our transit system was to get people throughout the city.
Yeah, but we're never putting transit in the areas that you're describing that are missing between the centers, the corridors, in areas outside the core.
to me, if we're trying to build capacity for transit, we should be treating these exactly the same. And if we're considering a measure that is adding an additional unit, I mean, I think you were the one who used the language the other day of making sure that areas are not opting out of density. I guess I really need an explanation of why we would have a measure that's different in one part of town than another.
Yeah, I just gave you an explanation. It's because it's about access to transit.
Okay.
I have
Councilmember Kitchen.
I guess from, my thought was that this is for preservation incentives. And of course, my only perspective is the districts that I know, so I may be totally wrong about this. But at least for the areas in my district that are further south, preservation is not the need. It's, so that's why it didn't concern me. For me, the preservation is really the problem in the urban core. So, but again, all I know is my area, so I could be missing something.
Do you want to propose an amendment to change that?
Yeah, I would make them the same in and out of the urban core. Preservation incentives should be considered citywide, allowing a unit beyond what would otherwise be allowed with the preservation of an existing structure, and put the from the the A. So preservation incentives should be extended, and then somehow enmesh the half-mile walk shed from the activity center, activity corridor, or transit priority.
Okay. So it
Network.
would say preservation centers should be expanded everywhere within a half-mile from an activity center, activity corridor, or transit priority network, so that additional unit beyond what would otherwise be allowed.
With the
Is allowed with
preservation of an existing structure.
Okay, is there a second to this amendment? Councilmember Poole seconds that. You want to say anything else, Kathy? Okay, further discussion on this?
I guess I would just emphasize again, if you look at the map, I think this allows us to make sure that we're hitting the high opportunity areas that the presentation on Tuesday highlighted. The area the map I'm looking at, again, it doesn't have it mapped, so it's a little hard to tell which areas would be missed, but I think having the same tool apply everywhere is the best route, especially if we're trying to build enough density for transit so that a transit system can go all over the city.
Further discussion, Councilmember Poole.
I like what Councilmember Tovo is recommending, and it also makes me feel like this really is a future-looking document that'll take us into the next 30 years.
Yes, Councilmember Alter.
So I'm not sure that I'm totally understanding this tool, but I have a concern on this, that how do we know that if they built this other structure, it would be another living unit? There are a lot of people in these high opportunity areas of means who could easily take advantage of this just to build bigger houses. This is not the same example, but I am dealing with a situation in my district where somebody had a house, I'm trying to see, it was an SF2 lot. It was so large that they were able to subdivide it, and they claimed they were building another unit of housing, and they're actually building a 3,000 square foot. They built a 3,000 square foot pool and gymnasium that's now next door to somebody's house, and it's not, there's not even a bedroom in it. And I understand this is happening under the current code, but it's something that we need to fix, and somehow we need to know that they're going to create another unit, or it's not necessarily going to be achieving the goals that we have in mind. And I'm not saying that it's not a good idea to preserve. I just, at some point, we have to figure out how we can put some guardrails on that, because I don't think that's what we want to be incentivizing.
Mayor, could I?
Yes, Councilmember Kitchen.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken, but I think that's what we need to look at when this language comes back to us. you know, that the how we actually get this done is something that we need to look to our staff to propose to us. I think the basic idea and the language we have here is preservation of the existing home. And I know I've seen the same kind of, or not that exactly, but I understand what you're saying, and that's some of the problem with the current McMansion ordinance. But, you know, I think that the statement that we're making here is the statement that we want to make, and then we need to look to what comes back to us in terms of options and really think about whether it's going to work or not.
And I guess I'm not necessarily objecting to the idea of trying to come up with preservation,
Okay.
And I don't necessarily have language to put in there, but as staff is looking at this, we have to be able to make sure that we are not going to just get even larger McMansions under the guise of creating additional units. I have no idea how to do that per se, but if we don't do that, there's enough wealth in this town that we will see a lot of that happening, and we will never be able to achieve our goals of lower impervious cover and less flooding and all of that other stuff, and we won't achieve the additional units.
I think the point is well taken, and obviously, the good thing is we don't have to know how to draft the actual rule here. These guys will do it later, but I think it goes without saying that we're trying to preserve an existing home and don't let people abuse it. So draft it in a way that doesn't allow for abuse. I think that covers that.
But even, I mean,
Draft it well. Sorry.
You know, in the case that I'm dealing with, like the site plan didn't even have a bedroom in it, and it was still allowed.
I think we can say existing home structure, with the preservation of an existing home structure.
Right, the home was preserved, but in building the other unit. So there's a part of this is whether you're preserving the existing home, and then there's a part of it is what kind of unit you're building. Is it another unit, or is it some other big part of your home? And in the case that we're dealing with, the site plan even said there was no bedroom, and it was still allowed when they subdivided.
So does we say a home unit beyond what we're allowed with the preservation of an existing home unit?
I don't know that we have to mess with the language. I just want to make sure that staff is aware that we have to do that. And I wanted to bring the issue up because it's a weird example, but it's one of the ways in which the market will not necessarily follow our guidance if we're not careful.
Okay. So noted. Yes, sir.
Are we still debating?
I'm sorry, what?
Councilmember Tovo's. We're still debating Councilmember Tovo's amendment.
We are debating Councilmember Tovo's.
I've lost track of exactly what it is and what it does.
I was going to ask that question again.
So does just to clarify, either the mayor or Councilmember Tovo, is what this amendment is essentially doing, making it only a half mile from corridors and centers all over the city, but not having the urban core? Is that what the motion does?
I don't think so.
And that's why I mentioned. That's why I admitted having lost track of what the amendment does.
It would be within a half-mile walk shed from an activity center, activity corridor, or the transit priority network, which is all over the urban core.
Which is all what?
All over the urban core.
But it does not say all of the urban core. What is it? You're amending it to just say half a mile from activity centers and transit priority.
Making it consistent throughout the
Correct.
Throughout
And
the
so
city.
the reason that as currently constructed, I'm voting no.
Yeah.
Is because this would remove sections of the urban core and it wouldn't. So it would just essentially, because it already is half a mile from all corridors and centers and transit priority network, plus urban core, and then this would actually be removing sections.
This removes the area in the urban core
That is not
a
half
half
mile.
mile approximate.
Can I speak to that?
Which, just to be clear, I think we saw a slide earlier about a half mile from transit priority corridor. I mean, and this is why some mapping would be helpful. A half mile from transit priority corridors, activity centers, and activity corridors pretty much covers a good deal of the urban center of the urban core. I don't think there'll be much left. I think we saw a slide earlier from the Hyde Park neighborhood representative that showed there were a couple blocks left if you map from a half mile from transit priority corridors in that area. Probably the same is true of a lot of the other neighborhoods in the urban core.
I understand. I just probably won't support an amendment that reduces this area.
Councilmember Kitchen.
I can't support that either. I mean, this is about preservation incentives, and my neighborhoods that are in the urban core, they need preservation incentives in their entire neighborhood, not just within, because we're getting tear downs of single-family homes, older single-family homes that are being torn down and replaced with a larger single-family home without, I know that the concern that Councilmember Alter raised will only be able to do so much given the market, but we should do whatever we can. And that kind of preservation is needed all throughout the neighborhoods in the urban core that I represent. So I can't support limiting this to just within a half mile.
Any further discussion before we vote?
Well, I would just say to Councilmember Kitchen, that's not the only, I mean, I have an amendment somewhere later about preservation incentives as well. This is to add an additional. So if you have the ability to do 3, you can then do 4. I mean, we could build in preservation, and I think we should, task the staff with doing exactly that, coming up with incentives for how we retain the existing structures throughout our urban core. Absolutely. I mean, that's a primary concern of mine. But this is to allow an additional, whatever the base ends up being. If it ends up being 3, they can then add 4.
With the preservation of an existing structure.
Okay, let's go ahead and take a vote. Those in favor?
Wait, I'm sorry, I have one question. So you have other amendments? Shouldn't we take her other amendments? But if it's the same. Okay. No,
Okay, let's take a vote. Councilmember Tovo moves to take out the urban core area, not a half mile proximate. Those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. Alter and Councilmember Tovo. Those opposed, raise your hand. It's a balance of the dais. Amendment does not go forward. Okay. Anything else on E? Okay.
Mayor?
And then did we vote?
Mayor?
Did we vote
Mayor?
on Jimmy's?
Mayor?
I think we voted on Jimmy's. Jimmy, that went in without objection. Yes, Councilor Poole.
I was just wondering if what Councilmember Tovo had recommended, if there were no limits, would that have achieved a positive vote on this dais? Because if that were the case, then maybe we should consider that. Because the limiting factor was the piece that I was opposing. I would like to see what she was recommending, but with no limits.
What do you mean? I'm not following you.
Your other amendment.
Okay, well, I'll wait till that comes up then.
Okay. All right, continuing on. I think that gets us then to the zoning map. I was going to recommend that in place of the language that we have at the top of page 4 under zoning map, that we bring in Councilmember Harper Madison's language from her amendment, which is her amendment in response to question number 2, where it says majority of new housing capacity should be within a half mile. I know you did a good job. Within a half mile of transit priority network as identified by Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. But I would like to know, Council Member, if you would allow us to add at the end of it, and imagine Austin activity centers and corridors. Councilmember Harper, are you okay with adding and imagine Austin activity centers and corridors? The majority of new housing capacity. And the
half-mile
imagine
transit priority networks as identified by the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan.
right,
And
the imagine Austin activity centers and corridors. And the reason I say that is because our blueprint had us trying to put 75% of our new housing within a half mile of imagine Austin centers and corridors.
I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
What was your amended language to her amendment, to your amendment?
And it's at the end, Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, comma,
Imagine Austin.
and imagine Austin activity centers and corridors.
Yeah, I am not going to be able to support this. For one thing, I think what we're now looking at is putting something. I mean, we've now asked them to create zoning that would support 405,000 units. And as I see it, we're back to directing most of that in particular areas. Your amendment extends it to a bit, but it's still, I think, as I look back, I mean, for one thing, we're operating really without going back and reflecting on some of the work that Fregonese and others did. As I look back at some of the housing capacity work that they did for us, looking back at draft 1, they had estimated how much housing capacity they could get on vacant land, how much through redevelopment and other means. And it's very clear that in urban core neighborhoods, especially those in the central city, you'll only get that increased capacity through wide-scale redevelopment. And the only way to achieve this much capacity in the area that's been designated, I think, is through wide-scale redevelopment. So I can't support this. And I want to revisit the amendment that we just took up because I think I got a little muddled, and I now understand what Councilmember Poole was suggesting. So once we've done with this,
we can go back to that then. I like the amendment only because so much of what we're doing, we reference all over the place that we're trying to operate this code in support of our strategic housing blueprint. And one of the strategic housing blueprints states real specifically that we want at least 75% of new housing units within 1/2 mile of Imagine Austin centers and corridors. So let's put that to Mr. Flanagan.
So shouldn't we say 3/4 to
Oh,
match
but
the
it was,
ASMP?
but it was a wider area. It included the transit priority networks as well.
So that would be less intense than focusing 75% just
Right.
on Imagine Austin.
I don't think there was a just.
And it does kind of create a conflict for staff between ASMP and this document. I would just as soon go with the ASMP version and expand it slightly to include the priority network.
Okay. I'm comfortable with that.
Mayor?
I'm sorry, I'm not, can you say it again? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
So in order to match the ASMP, which says 75% of new housing goes on corridors and centers, to take Councilmember Harper Madison's and say 75% of new housing capacity should be within 1/2 mile of transit priority networks as identified by the ASMP, as well as Imagine Austin centers, because that would be in rough compliance with ASMP.
Mayor?
I'm sorry, can
Yes.
you do that one more time?
Mike,
So
can-
75% of new housing capacity should be within,
1/2 mile of transit priority networks as identified by the ASMP, in addition to, or including, however we want to do that, centers, activity centers. Because that's what the ASMP basically says.
So, Mayor, on this one,
Yes?
that goes to my request that the staff help us with identifying all of the current activity centers and regional centers, because the Imagine Austin document is at least 7 years old. And the areas that were mapped back then have changed and expanded. And if I am going to support this, then I have to have some certainty that we're looking at the reality on the ground and not a vision that was crafted 7 years ago. So I want to make sure that this includes the updates to where activity centers are currently, and also where we imagine them to be in Austin, which is what I think the comprehensive plan was hoping through planning efforts to accomplish. So I'd like to amend this in order to be supportive of it, to include some statement with regard to direction to staff that says we want to engage in a process of identifying additional activity centers that have shown themselves surfaced since Imagine Austin was first adopted 7 years ago. That way we can have some sense that we're working with currency and also looking forward, so that, again, we have a future-looking, forward-looking comprehensive plan, and that we are responding in that way to it.
if I may, Councilmember Poole, I think what Jimmy said was including Imagine Austin activity centers and corridors, because the emphasis for me on here is the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, which we just passed unanimously. So I'd be
Right.
thinking like the
Sure.
primary focus is the ASMP.
And the adding in the Imagine Austin activity centers and corridors throughout all of this refers back to a document that is now 7 years old. And one of the things that I've challenged staff to do and the city manager to do is to come back to us with an acknowledgement that our city has grown and there are activity centers on the ground currently functioning really well, but they're not memorialized in our Imagine Austin map. And I think that is inhibiting some of our efforts here, and I would like to get beyond that and just simply agree that that is an effort that our staff, and I think they want to do it too. The city has evolved since we adopted Imagine Austin, but the activity centers are static in that document, and whenever we look at that map, they don't change, but we have changed. That and the strategic mobility plan, as you point out, that was newly adopted, and it reflects the reality on the ground now, and our future hopes for where we want to see our transit lines and our transit corridors to be in the future. I'm just asking for the same thing, the same effort with our Imagine Austin.
So I don't think those things are inconsistent with one another.
I'm sorry, they are or are not?
Are not.
Okay.
So I would propose that the amendments. She's asking for staff to look at whether or not we should be adding more given today's situation, and I think that's fine. So it would say 75% of new housing capacity should be within a half mile of transit priority networks as identified by Austin Strategic Mobility Plan and Imagine activity centers and corridors. And then there would be another sentence that says staff is requested to look at whether it is appropriate to add or change the existing add to or change the existing Imagine Austin activity centers.
To acknowledge the growth that may have occurred since we adopted Imagine Austin.
I would say growth or whatever they think is appropriate. So I would just say ask them to look at whether it's appropriate to add or change. I don't want to limit the things they can consider.
I don't either. And maybe Mr. Lloyd can help.
But if we don't list anything, we just say staff take a look at it and see if it's appropriate to add or change something, and they can consider anything they think is appropriate to do. They can look at demographic patterns, they can look at traffic patterns, they can look at anything that's happening regionally.
All of that, yes.
They can look at new business centers, they can look at where Apple is moving, they can look at anything.
Right.
And if we start listing something, I'm afraid we're going to leave something out.
I'm okay with not doing the list. It really is the intent that I want to make sure that I'm communicating, and maybe Mr. Lloyd can acknowledge or help me with that.
So are you okay, Mr. Lloyd, with a sentence that says that 75% of new housing capacity should be within half-mile transit networks as identified by the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan and Imagine Austin activity centers and corridors? Staff should look at whether it's appropriate to add to or change the existing Imagine Austin activity centers.
I have a problem with that.
Okay, let me hear from staff, and then we'll come to you.
Okay.
And what I would say before Brent talks is I don't know that we should ask staff if they think it's appropriate. What I would say is rather than the language that you offered, would locate appropriate changes to the future land use or the growth map that is in
And I'm fine
Austin, Imagine Austin, not whether we're asking them if they think we should do it, but rather to show us where it is on the ground currently.
And I'd like them to ask, I'm not asking them in the sentence here. It just says staff should look at whether it's appropriate to add, but I would like to know the answer to that. They could come back and say it's not appropriate to add because we have everything that it is that we're supposed to have. Or they could come back and say we need 15 more.
It doesn't go far enough, though. You're only asking them, is it appropriate? And I'm saying, tell us where it is appropriate to expand our future growth map.
And if so, tell us where. Or
Sure,
if so, recommend additions.
Absolutely.
And if so, recommendations. But does this concept make sense to you? Is this a good concept?
Brent Lloyd, Development Services. In principle, I think what you're getting at is basically including some potential recommendation on plan amendments as part of this. And I think that's something that we staff can certainly look at as part of the code development exercise. But one point I think that just needs to be clear is, like in Imagine Austin, when the centers were mapped, it wasn't necessarily just a matter of looking at where growth had occurred, but really looking at where we wanted to channel growth. Mm-hmm. And Councilmember Poole, when you describe it, the emphasis seems to be a little bit more on sort of looking at where growth has sort of naturally happened.
Right.
Okay.
And so looking at, if we were to go, if planning staff were to go look at where centers should be located, it would be more than just looking at where sort of growth has naturally occurred in the last 7 years. It would really be given our policies, given infrastructure, given all the factors that are generally considered, where ideally.
Okay. I think the Councilmember was okay with not putting in
Okay.
particulars. It just says staff should look at whether it is appropriate to add or change the existing Imagine Austin activity centers, and if so, to recommend it.
I'm sorry, can you say the sentence one more time?
75% of new housing capacity should be within a half mile of transit priority networks as identified by the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan and Imagine Austin activity centers and corridors,
We're
period.
saying and or including. I thought at some point we changed and to including.
I think it's and.
Okay.
Because it's.
And Imagine Austin activity
Centers and corridors, period.
Staff is requested to look at.
Staff should look at whether it is appropriate to add or change the existing Imagine Austin activity centers, and if so, to recommend it.
So again, we're not asking them if it's appropriate, and I don't necessarily want to change them because they are on the ground, but I do want to review them to see if we are adding to them because of organic growth. And I think that Mr. Lloyd understands that, but we are not asking them if it's appropriate. We are saying, where has that change occurred?
So staff
And
is
then,
requested to review.
yeah, and then further, he has said that planning staff would also like to look at where, based on our policies, we would like to have growth additionally. So it is both of those things.
So I'm
Just
trying
to update the growth maps. This
That's
is
what I'm trying
really
to do.
what I'm asking for, and not whether they think we should, but rather asking them to do it.
Okay, staff should update.
The growth maps.
So we'll just make the second sentence, staff should update the Imagine Austin growth map.
maps. Yes,
And
that's
corridors.
that is included in that. Yeah.
Okay.
We can
Staff
work
should
with that.
update their growth maps.
Thank you.
Can we please?
Of course,
add
they can't update
corridors
it
to
themselves. All they could be doing is coming back to us with a recommendation. I'm just trying to move past this so we can keep going to.
Right.
So
I think
staff
we're all
should-
looking for the same thing.
So
We
staff
want
should
fresh
recommend
information.
and recommend updates to the growth, Imagine Austin growth maps.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mayor.
Wait a second. Wait a second. Councilmember Kitchen.
I have a concern. I think the language is okay as long as we're on the same page in our understanding. Imagine Austin went through a lot of conversation and a lot of public input and a lot of looking to the future to designate those activity centers. And I'm not understanding that we should not be revisiting that. In other words, I don't want to change the activity centers that are identified right now. If there is appropriate to update and add, that's one thing. But I would not go back and revisit whether we should have activity centers where we've got them. Okay, I see the staff. Okay, I just want to make sure that that's the understanding.
And I agree with that too. I don't want them to. We can't change the policy that we already have in place, and I'm not intending that. Thanks.
Okay.
Mayor,
Yes.
without editing language, just to staff, the two regional centers I have in my district are very fuzzy, and they could really be more closely defined, like the activity center and the arboretum is more closely defined to condition. And that's something I would like to see in how this goes. And so it's just sort of a random circle, what appears random to my community, really fill in the gaps.
Right. And to this end, I don't think it's going to hold up the process for the rewrite of land development code. But as part of this, because if you came back and made a recommendation, as Councilmember Kitchen says, there's a long process that would be involved with changing Imagine Austin strategic plan. It's not intended to abrogate that, but while you're doing this work, if there are additional ones that you think should, bring it to our attention. That's what this is intended to be. Councilmember Kitchen.
I think this is fine here. I think it's also, when we get to the amendment that relates to planning, we might remember this.
Sounds good.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So is there any objection to adding the amendment as we've
The
discussed?
tiniest little objection. I'd also like to add, if we could revisit some of the missing corridors from Imagine Austin and add that as well. So where it says update growth map, could we do update growth map and corridors? Is that a possibility?
Imagine Austin corridors. Okay.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay. To the Imagine Austin growth maps. Okay. Because the growth maps contain both centers and corridors. Okay? All right. Councilmember Tovo objects to that amendment, so we need to put it to a vote.
Yeah, and can you just verify, I mean, this, is it 75% or the majority?
75%.
Okay. yes, I object.
Okay, the motion, the amendment to the amendment is to say 75% of the new housing capacity should be within a half mile of transit priority networks as identified by Austin Strategic Mobility Plan and Imagine Austin Activity Centers and Corridors, and staff should recommend updates to the Imagine Austin growth maps, including both centers and corridors.
And can we divide the question to take the separate elements,
Sure.
take the elements separately?
Take the first sentence.
Thank
Those in
you.
favor of the first sentence, please. What?
Mind reading the first sentence? 'Cause
Not a
not
problem.
all of us have the first sentence.
75% of new housing capacity should be within a half mile of transit priority networks as identified by the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan and Imagine Austin Activity Centers and Corridors. Those in favor of that, please raise your hand. Those opposed? Council members Alter, Tovo, and Poole vote no. The others voting aye. That is accepted. The second sentence, staff should recommend updates to the Imagine Austin growth maps, including centers and corridors. Those in favor of that, please raise your hand.
Just make a comment to that, please.
Yes.
Sorry, I know it's late and we've got a lot to do. I guess I'm now reflecting on what Councilmember Kitchen said. This was the product of such an extensive public process, and I think to try to do this without in the time, to have that be a component of what they're doing while they're rewriting the land development code, I think is kind of unworkable.
No, in fact, we expressly said it was not that. If they identify things, then that might mean that we should adopt a resolution or do something that
And
says,
come
hey,
back
we should
later and
open
deal
up
with
that
it?
door and
Okay.
do that. Or if they come back and say, hey, we're good, we shouldn't do anything else, then it is independent of it and it doesn't hold this up.
That's fine. I'm not going to support it for those reasons.
All right, those in favor of the second sentence, please raise your hand. Those opposed? Council members Alter and Tovo voting no, the others voting aye.
Mayor, very quick comment.
I just want to clarify, I don't really understand what this is doing, and I'm,
Okay,
rather than hold everybody
good.
up, I'm just going to.
Thank you, appreciate it. Yes, Councilor Sorry.
Quick comment to the 75%. I appreciate the amendment being brought up. I voted for it because it's what's in our strategic plan. Having reviewed this last year, it seems like a very, very high bar to reach. And frankly, if the staff do their best and come back to us and tell us what they've got, we've just set the bar, but we'll just have to see what they bring us back. It's a very, very high number given the way our city has unfortunately been built out.
And Mayor?
I would say that
Mayor?
as with respect to all things on this, you're going to come back to us and say, we couldn't get what you wanted, but this is as close as we could get, or whatever.
And Mayor, I
Councilor
just wanted to say in relation to that, I would have voted yes for the first part, for the first sentence if we had left it with the majority, because I think that may be more attainable. But we'll see what staff brings.
Okay, let's keep going. All right, yes.
Okay. I have an amendment to this section also, but I'll take it up later because I think it's additive, not changing.
Great, thank you. So that's taken care of then. Question 2, let's go to question 3. In question 3, the first amendment is on the top of page 5. It describes it says we should map transition zones. Any objection to this one? This is the top of page 5.
Whoa, whoa, oh.
What?
Mayor, I think we skipped on page 4 zoning map.
That's what we just did.
No.
We substituted Natasha's language for that.
I didn't understand that was a substitution. Okay, well then I need to make an amendment that we include back in there the language that says at the same time all parts of town should be expected to contribute to reaching, or all parts, let me just start with that part. All parts of town should be expected to contribute to reaching our ASHP and Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, housing and mode shift goals.
Anybody have an objection to that being added? Hearing none, that's added. Anything else here? Okay, then that gets us to transition areas on the top of page 5.
I have changes to
Okay.
the zoning map that starts at the bottom of page 4 and goes over to the top of page 5. So we're still in question 3, right? Zoning map.
We're in question 3.
Yeah.
The
zoning
change you can see It's underlined, it's on the top of page 5.
Right.
That's the
So,
language in front of us, at the top of page 5.
yeah. So, so that's the section that I have a change. Yeah, okay, so it's on my page 5. Under number 2, zoning map. And what I've said here, I have to think about how to meld it with this, but basically, it's increasing opportunities for missing middle housing will be a continuing goal for future district-level planning projects. And then provide options and a timeline for mapping changes to zoning, because this is about mapping, and so what I've added is provide options and a timeline for mapping changes to zoning to achieve additional housing capacity and affordable housing goals, to include provisions such as use of upzoning, future land use maps, and/or zoning upon sale of a property, especially to achieve beyond the 10-year housing goals.
And how is this changing the transition area?
Well, because the way this is written, this is not I'm changing the zoning map at the bottom of question 3 because this says just map it. So I'm saying, no, don't just map it. Come back and provide options and a timeline for mapping it. And you can consider a whole range of things, including immediate upzoning or flums and/or zoning upon the sale of property. I mean, there might be a combination of tools. So it's clarifying the language that's here.
So help me if I understand. What this says is, as part of the work that they're doing now, we're asking them to map middle missing housing adjacent to activity centers, going 2 to 5 lots deep, and to consider context-sensitive factors.
Right.
And you're saying, I mean, the timeline is set. It's when they're coming back with a map.
No.
That's what you want to change. You want it not necessarily to come back with the map.
Yeah, the not necessarily. I mean, they could come back with a map. I mean, basically, I'm saying provide options and a timeline for mapping changes. So you've got the term map here. So I'm saying, what does that mean? And so I'm suggesting that could mean a range of things. And I'm asking the staff to provide the options for the range of things, all the way from going ahead and mapping it now, or to suggesting that there may be some areas that are appropriate for a flum or for zoning upon sale of the property.
Yeah. I'm not going to be able to support that because I want them to come back with the transition zones mapped. But I understand that. Is there a second to Councilmember Kitchen's amendment?
Could I speak to that for a
Yes,
moment?
let me get a second for it first, if there is one. Councilmember Poole seconds it, okay?
Okay, well then tell me what that means, mapping now.
That means when they come up with the maps, we wanted to show transition zones.
Okay.
Transition areas, rather.
But what does that mean? Does that mean that when we map, we are immediately upzoning every place in the city? Immediately? Because that's what this is saying. It's not allowing for the potential that in some places and I also have here, especially to achieve beyond the 10-year housing goals. We've got a multi-year goal here. And so it may be appropriate, it will be appropriate to upzone immediately in some places, but it may not be in others. And so this doesn't give us or the staff any opportunity to have a conversation about what our options are.
Mayor,
Councilmember Casar.
I would be willing to accept saying we could have options for achieving beyond our 10-year goals, beyond the 2 to 5 lots. But the idea being we want to get generally 2 to 5 lots done this year. And if we want to have future land use maps to go beyond our 10-year goal, then it should be beyond the 2 to 5 lots.
Well, I think that's good. I think that's better than what we have here, but it's not going far enough for what I think is important. But, it's up to everyone else, of course, on what y'all think. But the bottom line here is and I can get into this more when we get into the transition zones, we don't know the impact of what's being proposed for these transition zones. So to just say that we're going to map them without giving the staff the opportunity to come back to us and say, well, for these particular parcels, it makes sense to go ahead and upzone them right now. for these others, because of various reasons that include our goals, it might make sense to consider some other options. That's all I'm asking
Okay.
for.
There's been a motion and a second to not necessarily map the transitions areas now, but to have staff come back and make recommendations as to the appropriate timing and methods.
That's not what I said.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not being clear.
Okay.
Staff can come back with a map. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying that they can come back with a map, or they can come back with a partial map if they think that there are areas that should be mapped later, or they can come back with a FLUM. I'm not saying they shouldn't map. I'm just trying to acknowledge that there may be some circumstances under which it is important to have more tools.
Okay, I understand. Now better, thank you. Councilmember Kitchen's motion is to say you don't necessarily have to map now, you can, but you can also come back with a future plan for alternate ways that it might be handled. Yes, Councilmember Flanagan.
So I like the language that Ann has in the context that Greg laid it out, where we're talking about, but it seems like a planning tools paragraph, and so I'm not sure this is the right place for it, but to have these tools be how we get past the 10 years, given it's a 30-year code but a 10-year blueprint, that stuff I really, really like. I'm agnostic to, not in love with defining the 2 to 5 lots, but I've got amendments on the compatibility question that address the transition zones, which to me is as much a compatibility question as it is anything else where we've talked about that before.
Okay, we have an amendment in front of us. It's been seconded. Yes, Councilmember Garza.
I'm not going to support that amendment, and I'm just, again, I know you probably didn't mean it, but even if they do come back with the map, it is not immediately doing anything. It's just a draft of a map. It's not fully implemented until we finish this entire process.
Okay.
Yes, Councilmember Tovall.
So I think that, as I thought about what are going to be the real pieces of this that could make it challenging for us to get through this process this year, I think it's the direction we're headed with regard to transition zones and the direction we may be headed with regard to compatibility, just based on some of the amendments I saw. I think that 2 to 5 lots is maybe not significant in some of the areas you were talking about. Councilmember Kasari, you talked about 50 lots on a street. Well, that's not typically true of other neighborhoods in other districts, including mine. You're talking about, if it ends up being 5 lots on one of the streets that I was, walking and taking photos of, there were about 17 lots. So then you're talking about 10 on that street potentially. I think that this is going to be really a very challenging point if we're trying to get through this. I also think that if we had speakers today and we've had conversations about, needing to increase this level of density to support transit, I think it is going to be, if people in the areas that are most impacted by these transition zones see this as connected to our plans for high capacity transit, I think it's going to potentially not create the positive embracing of that we want. I also think that in many of our existing central city neighborhoods, this level of transition zone is actually going to replace exactly the kind of housing that we're trying to encourage. I showed one example of that the other day. If we had, 12 more hours, I could take another 30 minutes and show you 34th Street or 35th. We have lots and lots of streets in my district and probably in others as well, where you have exactly the kind of housing we would be encouraging the redevelopment of with a transition zone that is this big. So, when we started talking about it, it was kind of the lot and back was with regard to compatibility, and then maybe another lot, but 5 is a lot. And again, I think there's a lot of advantages to trying to come up with something that, with the understanding that this is going to be a long process of creating a level of capacity. We don't need to create it all out of the box, and allowing some level of more specific context level planning, as Councilmember Kitchen has suggested, I think is appropriate, especially if we want to make those choices about where the best areas are and where we want to have those.
Councilor Kassar.
3 quick things. One, when we get to the next section, I'm going to continue to support one criteria that is trying to listen or address the concern you raised, which is for neighborhoods that are smaller, that never more than a majority of the single-family area will be zoned in transition. So then the example that you gave, it would not be 10 out of the 17 lots. And I'm going to continue to support that out of acknowledgement that there's a lot of competing interests and questions, but trying to move us forward today. And then second, I think to the older multifamily question, I think we have some stuff in here trying to protect that. And then third, to a final point, I think that when because we provide the zoning, it's going to take some time for that transition zone to develop. I don't think that you're going to be getting immediate change that I think some folks have worried about. I know when we get to compatibility, I also want to pass something out to start incorporating some of the criteria or concerns that Councilmember Kitchen has raised, but I think maybe it's best to wait till we get to the compatibility standards and priority matrix for that part.
Councilor Kitchen.
I have a suggestion. So what if we said this, in addition to mapping, provide options and a timeline for making changes to zoning? So in other words, the map would come back to us and we would understand, because there's a 2-step process. There's mapping and then there's us voting for the upzoning and the mapping. So I would just like more information as part of the mapping. So could we not say, in addition to mapping, provide options and a timeline for making changes to zoning to achieve additional housing capacity, and then go on for the rest of that sentence? Because what's going on here is 2-step process, as Councilmember Garza pointed out. There's the mapping, and then there's the actual.
Before you describe it, help me locate the language again.
It's on page 5 of my document.
Okay, page 5 of 8.
Yeah.
And what were you recommending?
I was recommending and just leaving out the first sentence, and then just of my red underline, and then saying, in addition to mapping, provide options and a timeline, and then instead of mapping, say for making changes. I don't know if there's a better word than making, but for making changes to zoning to achieve, and then go on with the rest of that sentence.
Okay, I'd be fine with that. It gets added to the other language.
Right.
Is there any objection to that? I'm sorry, what?
No, it's added.
It's additive.
I'm sorry, you have to read that to me again.
Okay. You ready?
Yes.
In addition to mapping, provide options and a timeline for making changes to zoning, and then you just go on with the rest of the sentence there. You see
Okay.
where I'm talking
So we could make that.
Okay, it's on page 5.
I'm there.
Okay, so we're leaving off that first sentence in red.
Leave off increasing opportunities
Yeah.
for missing middle housing, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah.
I mean, if people want that, we can keep it,
And
but
then start where? At provide?
yeah, in front of provide, say, in addition to mapping, comma, provide. Options and a timeline for, and then delete mapping and replace that with making changes.
Okay. This could be a section B after the section A in the document.
Yeah, it
A
can
is
if it
about
fits,
mapping,
if it
and
fits
B is
better.
beyond mapping.
It could go there if you want to
Okay.
do that.
Does anybody have an objection to that?
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't understand what that means. I mean, this whole exercise is supposed to be zoning it in the map. And so what is the timeline for?
What that means is that when the staff is going to bring us back a proposed map that we then have to vote on before there's any zoning change. So this just means at the point at which they'll bring us back a map so we can see. And then they can say, we recommend that you upzone it all now, or we recommend that you, here's your options about what you do right now. That's all. But it would map it so that people could see what the mapping is.
Okay, and it's giving us options.
Well, you know, there's a range.
So I understand that when we get the map, it doesn't rezone it, but when we adopt the map, it rezone it. But I just want to make sure I'm understanding. I think this may be very good. I'm not fully understanding it.
At the same time they bring the mapping back, they bring us back. At the same time they bring the mapping back, they bring us back options for actually making changes. And they might say that for this particular area, and I don't know because we don't know the impact on these areas. They might say for this particular area, for various reasons, you know, one of your options are to go ahead and vote for the zoning change right now, or perhaps to vote for the zoning change at another time. I just want us to see the full range of tools. So, for example, the Planning Commission, what they recommended when they described their transition zones, they recommended use of a flum as a way to get towards those changes. I don't have a recommendation at this point about what we should be doing. I'm just saying that we need to understand what our tools are and what our options are.
And to be clear, in this staff, what this would have is a majority of the council is saying, give us the map, the transition, map it. At the same time, you bring that back to us if there are other options, especially as relates to, you know, going beyond the 10-year plan, which is part of that, but not limited to that. Bring back options. And that way, if someone during the deliberation later says there's a better idea than the way that you've mapped it, they have the ability to be able to present that and argue that.
Yeah, but I'm saying something a little different. I mean, that is part of it, but I'm saying that mapping does not equal zoning changes. We have to vote for the zoning changes. So they may bring us back a map, and then we say, okay, here's what this will look like at the point which you make the change. For whatever reason, your options are to make that change today, vote for it today, or to make that change in a year or two, to make that change according to a flum, or to make that change when the property's sold. There may be various reasons.
But wouldn't that be true for any part of the map, anywhere in the city? They're going to come back with a map of the city.
Sure, I'd like to see it everywhere.
I mean, so we could, when we're looking at the map, either take it or not take it, but a majority of the council is intending to give us a map that we could adopt as part of this.
But giving us a map, I don't think you can say that the majority of council is saying, give us a map and we're automatically going to vote on it, because we don't know what the map looks like.
No, clearly not.
Okay.
No automatic. But there's nothing special about transition zones. I mean, it's true that when they come back with a map and a code, we can either adopt the map, change the map, delay the map, anywhere in the city. But the map that comes back, this is asking you to map transition zones as part of the map that you bring back. Just like you're going to map corridors and you're going to map activity centers, you're going to map the city. You're going to map transition zones as described in this. Councilman Garza.
I just want to say again, we could not adopt a map the day they give it to us. There's a process. We'd have to do notices. We cannot be rezoning the entire city the day they bring us back that map. I'm going to keep saying that.
And I did not say that. What I said is, I want to understand what our tools are. In other words, come back and tell us. There's a range of ways in which to map. There's a range of ways in which to vote on the zoning. That's all I'm asking for, is to give us the information about what those are, instead of just giving us a map with no information on what our options are.
I would say give us that kind of options everywhere in the city. Yes.
Mayor and Council, Brent Lloyd, Development Officer, DSD. Just a couple points of clarification. So when the option you've chosen in the first question and the scope question is to adopt a new map and a new code. And so we will be bringing you back an entirely new zoning map. And to Mayor Pro Tem Garza's point, it will not require mailed notice like a rezone does. When we're adopting, and law has advised previously publicly that when we're adopting a whole new code and a new map, that can be done through published notice. To Councilmember Kitchen's point, the way that the city would potentially leave areas in current zoning and not have new zoning go into effect with the map would be through the F25 classification. So the way to have certain areas where the new zoning would not take effect would be to label them on the map as former Title 25, and that has the effect of freezing the current zoning in place. The other option, though, which I feel like may be what Councilmember Kitchen is getting to, but I just want us to be clear, is to bring back a zoning map that does apply new zoning, but in certain areas applies new zoning categories that are fairly close to what we have today, deferring the process of more intensive upzoning to a later process. And if you would like staff to, in sort of bringing back mapping options, to do that, that would certainly be an option that staff could consider in looking at the different transition zone scenarios. But in order to completely defer any new zoning from taking effect, the tool would be the former Title 25 F25 category.
Okay, and that's not what I'm saying. So what I'm saying, I appreciate that, but I want to make it really clear. I'm not saying don't map the transition zones, because we all need to see what that looks like. I'm just saying that mapping does not automatically mean voting for it, to Councilmember Garza's point, but I would just like to understand what our options are, just from a tools perspective, and I think that's all I'm asking for. Go ahead and bring us back the map that's mapped, but just bring us back, even if it's, I'm not suggesting that the map is even different. I'm just suggesting a conversation and a discussion of what other communities have done in terms of tools that they have used for when they actually make the changes. That's all I'm talking about.
So my only concern is that we create an ambiguity with this conversation about whether we mean A. And I think we mean A. We want to map a transition zone. I'm fine with asking for more options. We could take B and say that applies to the whole code everywhere. But by this section, I want the instruction to be that we're asking it to be mapped for transition areas as described. I don't have any problem with them giving options or informations or other kind of data that someone could then argue before we start adopting anything that we do alternatives. But just to be really clear and not ambiguous, the direction from this council in A is to map transition zones as part of the mapping and code drafting. Okay, do we need to take a vote on A?
Could I?
Councilmember Alter.
I have several questions on A, but I just wanted to point out an example that might be something, at least that I would be interested in. So depending on what we adopt for the transition zone lot number, there will be communities where that is more than a majority, but we have kind of very vague direction on what that means. And so one might imagine that we may be given, it may be called out that this area, we can't do it because of that, and the map may have one possible version of it, and then we might be given alternatives, ways that we could look at that, because it's not very clear direction. It's important direction, but it's not very clear direction, and so that might be one of the places where, here's a place where this comes in and we don't have fully clear, this is our first recommendation, here's another option to look at.
Okay, on the next page.
Wait, I have stuff on the lots part. I have some questions for you. So could you please clarify your intention by having the language that the jurisdiction zone should generally be 2 to 5 lots deep was meant to cap the zone at no more than 5 lots?
Okay, so with respect to the first question that you asked, it's very clear under the direction on the next page, item C, that hasn't before us yet, but it's contemplated, it's part of the same amendment package. It says the depth and scale of transition zones, it should be areas. The depth and scale of transition areas should be reduced so that the transition areas do not overlap with the majority of the existing single-family neighborhood area. That means that staff in mapping it will not map more than half of any neighborhood in transition areas, no matter where the corridors are. So that's something that by the description here cannot happen. That's the answer to your first question. The second question, sorry.
My first one wasn't a question, it was just a comment on that.
I just didn't want anybody watching it to think that there was anybody proposing doing anything in more than half of the neighborhood. And that transition zones, to the degree that 5 would make more than half in the transition zone, then it's not going to be 5. It has to be something less than 5. So I don't want anyone to see that and think that it's being contemplated that a transition area could be more than half of the neighborhood. To the next point, the generally means generally. That means that that's what we want to do. But if staff felt like there was a situation because of, I don't know what the factor would be, because of a particular block, because of the location of a commercial area, because of, I don't know what it would be. I wouldn't want them to feel constrained that they couldn't come back to us and say, in this instance, we felt like we needed to vary from the rule. But generally, the rule is 2 to 5 lots.
So it doesn't cap it at 5.
I'm sorry, what?
So it doesn't cap it at 5.
Except for an exigent or rare situation, that's correct.
So can we cap it at 5 and have staff provide circumstances to us where they might want to exceed that and call those out for us, and then we could make a decision?
I think that I'm comfortable with the language that says generally the area should be 2 to 5 lots deep.
Okay. Then I would like to make my amendment on motion sheet 1.
Okay.
Amendment 2, which says, notwithstanding any other context-sensitive criteria adopted in this document, the mapping of missing middle housing types should not extend any further than 1 to 4 lots into the interior of existing residential neighborhoods. This may be revisited in the future in the context of small area planning efforts.
Okay. Is there a second to this amendment? Councilmember Kitchen seconds that. Is there any discussion?
I'm comfortable with generally because I want to give staff some discretion.
Any further discussion? Yes, Councilmember Tovo.
I think that's a very good compromise, and yeah, especially given the issues we talked about earlier, I think that's a very good compromise.
And I'm comfortable with generally meaning the original language.
Right. And I'd point out that the language that says generally 2 to 5 lots is already a significant compromise. Councilmember Flanagan, and then Councilmember Ellis.
So I just repeat my issue with defining the number of lots only because lot sizes vary pretty wildly across the city, especially lots on corridors where sometimes the first lot is really, really big. Sometimes it's really, really small. And I'm also curious about what the definition of existing residential neighborhoods might mean, because there will be parts of corridors that are residential but not single family that we will want to zone transition because they're kind of already transition. There'll be parts of neighborhoods that already have some mixed small multifamily. So are we talking about a majority of the existing single family homes? Is it a majority of, so I think I'm just struggling with the borders of the thing by which we are saying a majority of. When there's such a diversity of building scale and building uses along these corridors and centers.
I trust staff to be able to wrestle with that and come back with something that's reasonable. I don't think we can parcel, I don't think we could describe through all of that, but I think this states what the general intent and what direction would be for the staff.
And I think that, and I might be fine just moving forward since we've kind of aired all this out, but that's why my preference was just to stick with distance from corridor and then let staff work it out from there, because I think that's the primary metrics as opposed to number of lots.
Okay.
Mayor?
Yes. Councilor, no, I'm sorry. Councilor Ellis was next.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I'm more comfortable sticking with 2 to 5. It was higher in our work session, and as we were trying to kind of work on this document, we already pulled it back a little bit, but we did also add a line in the next section that talks about staff coming back and telling us if we're hitting our housing goals. So there may be other places where more density is appropriate, and neighborhoods where we've added language about not having a majority being upzoned too far.
Okay. Yes, Councilmember Padilla.
And I'm going to support that also because I think that there are going to be areas where it can go 5 lots, and then there's some that you're not going to be able to. So, but I want to keep it in there.
Okay. Councilmember Tovo and Councilmember Kitchen.
I needed to ask a question about what Councilmember Ellis just said. Were you suggesting that in some areas, and maybe it's best to address it in the next, but were you suggesting that there might be areas in which the staff could come back and tell us it's recommended to go beyond the majority of the neighborhoods being mapped for transition? Was that the example you were using?
I think staff's going to do the best to follow our directions as given, but we wanted to make sure we were hitting our housing goals. So when we do see some sort of mapping and direction on where things are actually playing out with the rules that we are trying to guide them towards, we need to keep in mind that we are trying to increase our housing goals and to have them help us estimate exactly if we're achieving that or not.
Even if it means going beyond the majority of a neighborhood being mapped?
I would still be supporting not having a majority of the neighborhood be affected by that.
All right, thank you. I guess I just wanted to make an observation in case by the late hour. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it. I wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying on that. I just want to make an observation that as we're continuing down this path, one of the reasons I'm supportive of Councilmember Alter's amendment is that I think we've said again and again in different places that we're starting with draft 3. I think several of these amendments are really taking us back to draft 1, where we had transects and we had T4 zoning. The kind of things we're contemplating now are really going beyond draft 3 in terms of the zoning that we looked at in that. And I, as we looked at the Fragonese report, I believe he estimated that with in the transect zones, 25% of that would be redevelopment and displacement. So I think that's should continue. Again, that body of work that was done, I think, should continue to be a guiding body of work for us. But we are getting further and further away from draft 3 and closer to that first draft, which I think set us on a path where it was really challenging to get community support and buy-in.
Councilmember Kitchen.
It may be, I would suggest we set this aside and go straight to talking about the transition zones, because I'd like to make an observation also. I'm a couple of things. One of my major concerns, and the reason that I'm suggesting the language that I am under transition zones, is we are suggesting prescriptive kinds of language without information. As Councilmember Flanagan just pointed out, to say between 2 to 5 lots deep when there's such a huge difference across the city on what that means, and we don't know what they are. So we're saying generally, we're telling staff to generally go between 2 to 5 lots deep. We haven't given them any criteria for what that means. What does generally mean? So that's one concern that I have. And I just think that I just think that we're trying to go down a road to prescribe something when we don't have information, and it's not necessary to prescribe at this point. When we get to the next section, what I'm going to propose is starting with something that Council members Flanagan, Harper Madison, and Renteria suggested, which is to say, we want our density along the core, and we want to step down from there. And this is the kind of criteria that we want to use to step down from there. Staff come back and give us options. But to actually prescribe exactly what that step down is without any information about what that looks like, and given the differences across all of these areas, it just doesn't make any sense. I don't see how and why. I don't even see why we would do that.
Yeah, I think it generally gives the staff direction to be able to come up with a map. I think they can take into these accounts. Jim, I think your point is good. I think there might be some areas where this doesn't work this way. But when they go through the mapping exercise, I think we'll be able to identify those. But by asking them to do that, I think we force that exercise. And since we're not voting on the ordinance at this point, I think this is going to be the best way to daylight anywhere that does not work that way. a lot of the things that you put later on, remember, I'm also going to support because I think that they also will give direction and guidance to the staff when they try to sort through these issues and they come up with this map. Okay, what's in front of us now is still the section A. Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. When I think about what provoked anxiety when we were looking at Code Next, it was ambiguity and the fear of the unknown. Under this language, I will not be able to tell the community that we won't go deep off the corridor more than 5 lots. And I will have to be honest with them that it could go further. And I just, if we had a cap at 5, at least I could say it won't go further than 5. Because it's still very vague to say it won't cover a majority. And while I appreciate that caveat, I don't, if I answer honestly that it can go more than 5, that is possible under what we're putting forward by not having a cap. So if we had a cap, we would at least be able to tell them it wasn't going more than 5 lots in. And I think that would allow us to be able to be not engendering fears, even when we tell the truth about what's going on. And I think as we're making the rest of the decisions tonight, which are some of the thornier issues, I think still we need to remember that when we interject uncertainty and ambiguity into this process between now and the mapping, we are going to face folks who are going to respond to that very similarly than what they'd responded to before under Code Next. So, if you would entertain a cap, I would appreciate that. I would also say that, you started at 7, and some of us were already uncomfortable with 1 lot in, and 4 is halfway between there, not 5. So that's why I put forward my amendment, and if we're not going to have a cap, then I would like at least a vote on my amendment.
And we could certainly have a vote on your amendment. And I hope that when you talk to your constituents, as you just mentioned, that you just don't paint the worst possible case, but you also tell them that it could be less than that. And I hope that when you talk to your constituents, like when you raised some concerns in the email that you just sent out, and some of those are not going to be realized by the action that's being taken here. And I hope you report to your constituents that while you had emailed that something was a possibility, when the council got together, they rejected that possibility and came up with something else. So I hope that when you're talking to your constituents that you present everything.
I think that you should know me well enough to know that when I talk to my constituents, I am very honest about what we've done, and I try my best to educate them.
Okay. The amendment in front of us is Councilmember Alter's amendment. Further discussion. Councilmember Kitchen. And then let's vote.
I'm sorry. I just have to say this. It's I'll be showing my constituents the language we end up with, but I can't answer the question about what it means in terms of generally the transition area should be between 2 and 5 lots, because this doesn't tell me based on what. What is the determining factor or criteria for staff to determine whether it goes 2 lots or 3 lots or 4 lots or 5 lots? So there's no criteria here.
The criteria is in the next section.
Okay, well, when we get to that, I'll be able to explain why I don't see criteria in the next section either.
That's okay. Let's take a vote. Those in favor of the Alter amendment to A, please raise your hand. Councilmember Alter, Kitchen, Tovo, and Poole. Those opposed, raise your hand. The balance of the dice. Okay. Do you want to propose something in B, Councilmember Kitchen?
Yes. I'm sorry, could I clarify where we ended up here? Because I was a little confused. So we kept A, 1, and 2 without change, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Platinum?
But we added part of mine in, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We added what?
We added my language, part of my language in.
Yes. Say what?
Did you have language too?
No, we haven't added B yet. All we did was A, and A, 1, and 2 are the same. Then the question I asked Ms. Kitchen was, did she want to offer a B? We had separate votes.
okay, I'm
Councilmember
sorry.
Poole asked us to divide the vote.
I'm sorry.
We divided the vote.
I'm sorry. So
Okay.
the B was the language that we had talked about before.
In
The-
addition to mapping,
Yeah,
and
okay.
then it was kitchen on page
Yeah.
5 of 832.
Uh-huh.
And I'm comfortable with that language so long as you understand this is not in any way questioning or coloring the instruction in A. But it certainly would give additional information for someone who is trying to evaluate that or consider that at the time. Councilmember Kitchen moves section B. Is there any discussion? Ready to take a vote? Yes?
Can we please read the last thing that we agreed upon on that section?
Okay.
The bouncing back and forth, I gotta tell y'all, is triggering my ADD. So, like, let's try to stay as linear as possible.
Okay. You ready?
Yes.
It says, in addition to mapping, and remember this is B, so it'll refer to A. In addition to mapping, provide options and a timeline for making changes to zoning to achieve, and it goes on with the rest of the sentence. Do you want me to read the rest?
Provide options and timeline, but
In addition to mapping,
then you excluded mapping there. You said you wanted
I changed it to making because,
making changes to zoning to achieve additional housing capacity.
yes, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Okay. B has been moved. Take a vote. Those in favor of B, please raise your hand. Councilmember Flanagan and Alter, Kitchen, Tovo, and Poole. Those opposed, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the balance of the dice.
Mayor, I thought you said earlier that you would take this language.
I was just trying to make the language better. I was concerned about the ambiguity that was created. Okay, continuing on. I guess it gets us to question number 4. The first amendment in here is in section 2. Anybody have any changes to that? Okay.
Let me get to it just a second.
Okay.
Mayor. I'm ready, Mayor.
Yes,
You
Flanagan?
go ahead.
Yeah. So on question 4.2 code text, that's what we're on right now?
Her language, it's underlined.
Is it in order to strike the first half of that at this time?
No, because that's not part of her amendment. You could strike the first half of what she's underlined. That you could do.
We can't remove things?
You can remove her amendment.
Her thing, okay. So then I'll come back and do that
Okay.
later.
You want me to go ahead?